Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hello there! Today I'll be taking you with me on a journey through my illustration process. The video is a bit of an odd one. I've written the script alongside the painting steps, so as of writing this part, I don't really know how this is going to end up. See, the thing is, I love watching time-lapses of paintings by other people, and you can learn a lot from doing so. If nothing else, you can clean their workflow and the order in which they tackle a piece of theirs. While some steps are rather universal, like sketching things out before diving into a painting, there's more that goes into a piece that we are often not that privy of just with a time-lapse. So I'll be giving some commentary on my thoughts and techniques along the way, as well as some tips that might be helpful to you. So get your pencils ready and let's defeat this illustration in honorable combat. Now, the initial brainstorming. This will require a bit of foreknowledge of my OCs to follow along, so let me get you all up to speed, whether you're new here or it's just been a while. I'm currently working on an illustrated novel about my OCQ, an amnesiac woman washed ashore close to a port city who turns out to have some magical abilities in a world that learned to fear magic not too long ago. She's looking for her place in the world, hoping to find a clue in the past she can't access. She only knows that she was at sea at some point, but the ocean is vast and dangerous, and the world even more so. Keeping all of that in mind, I've got a lot of drawings featuring Q with a body of water, mostly the ocean, and I don't get tired of it. There is something about painting water that is both incredibly frustrating, but also oddly relaxing. If I find out what it is about that, I'll be sure to share that knowledge. And in regards to Q, well, she is one of my oldest OCs and quite the comfort character when it comes to drawing, which means the concept is pretty easy. Q and the ocean. I'll draw that and hopefully find a way to frame it nicely. But even with those two core elements set in stone, there's more to think about. What kind of weather, what kind of beach, the time of day, is it a high angle, a low angle, how is Q fitting into this piece, is she sitting, is she walking, is she running, is she diving? The answers to all of these questions will influence how this piece is going to turn out. I dug through my Pinterest boards for some inspiration. Since at least some things I said, it's easier to look for the other elements and then piece the big things together, like a nice patchwork. Here's just a word of caution in regards to Pinterest though. AI-generated pictures are rampant on the platform. These are no good as references or inspiration. They don't take into account artistic vision or intent. A computer can't check these visuals for sense, since a computer doesn't know what things look like. It only knows what people told it what things look like. And if you've ever played the telephone game, you know how great we are at relating things accurately. Most of my pins on Pinterest have been on boards since before the flood of AI slop hit the internet at large and Pinterest in particular. So I'm quite confident that the pins I looked at are photos or paintings. Whether they have accurate attributions is another question though. I did pin a whole lot of photos of a bird's eye view on the surf, and I really liked the look of those, so that settled a rough view of the background and I got to thumbnailing. One thing I'll say for thumbnailing in my process, I don't do it enough. For comic pages I tend to finagle with layers a lot more than with illustrations. Here I tend to go with my gut a bit more. However, I'm not a professional artist. I don't work in a studio environment, I don't have to respect a production pipeline, and I don't work with clients either. I do these illustrations purely for myself, with the occasional illustration getting a print run. So if I lose time because I didn't put in the work up front, there aren't any costs sunk into it other than my own time. For this illustration, I started out with 3 thumbnails, each showing Q in another pose variation. Even though they are all rather similar, she's looking over the coast into the distance, not rooted in the here and now. I settled on a rough background by the second thumbnail as well, and once I've settled on one thumbnail that I like, I blow it up to the actual size and start sketching over it. In this case, I also played with canvas orientation a bit up front in the thumbnails in order to see the composition right away. Sometimes I'll just try to get the sketch out first and look at framing later. This might cut some stuff off, but at this point not much time and effort has been put into the illustration, so better to get this out of the system at this stage. I tend to go with just the A sizes of paper. It's the most convenient, since every app and program under the sun has these as presets, and if I want to make a print out of a piece, it's just easier to prep files that way. Another note here, I've been experimenting with different apps on the iPad recently, since I'm feeling underwhelmed by Procreate and the iPad. So for this particular thumbnailing and sketching session, I used Art Studio Pro. Hence why you see me open a bunch of menus trying to find things. I don't have my workflow nailed down with this app yet, however, that's a technical aspect, not so much the art aspect. It was bogging me down a little bit though, so first step, learn your tools. At the end of this sketch, I also figured out another part of interest, an approaching storm, which would give the entire piece a bit more tension and disguise something better than fluffy clouds. At this point in the process, I'm also abandoning the iPad for my PC and Art Studio Pro for Clip Studio. It's time to take out the big guns. All of this fancy tech is not necessary though, especially up to this point. A piece of printer paper and a pencil can get you this far just as well, without any issues. I like to mix it up from time to time as well, so sometimes I do the thumbnailing and initial sketching on my iPad, sometimes in my sketchbook, other times I write in Clip Studio, and sometimes it's just on a little piece of scrap paper. All come with their own advantages, but those don't really affect the result too much. Now for the next steps, I need to preface that I'm primarily a digital artist. I dabble in traditional media sometimes, but my love is reserved for the digital canvas. As such, I did buy myself a big screen tablet nearly a decade ago, which makes the digital painting process a lot more comfortable for me. I used these graphic tablets that are in essence a fancy mouse before, and they work well enough. I personally just missed my hand-eye coordination with these, so I saved up for a really expensive one at the time. I have no regrets in that, but I feel I should disclose that. After all, my Cintiq is a vital part of my particular process. At this stage, the illustration fought back. Freshly arrived in Clip Studio, I went ahead and mapped some preliminary values. These are far from final and definitely not deep enough. It's just to give me an idea on how this piece is supposed to read later on. I shifted the storm to the right for the time being, but it made the piece feel a little unbalanced. Before I took this further, I decided to anchor the thing that I was sure of better into the piece: Q. I went ahead and inked her. I knew her coattails might be subject to change later on, depending on how I want to change the topography of her little outlook down the road. But that would be an easy fix later on. I briefly thought about having her painted in rather than inked, but painting characters is not a strength of mine. I default to inking more often. I need to put more work into painting people first, before I put a spotlight on that in a YouTube video. Since the values weren't really helping me in this case, I decided to just go ahead and plug in colors and check my values as I go. An easy way to check your values is to put a layer on top of the stack, which is set to color in the layer blending mode. Filling that color with any grey, white or black will give you a grayscale look at your drawing. This works in every program or app that lets you set layers to color. However, I know that Photoshop has a way to open a file in a second instance, which can then be put into grayscale mode, so you have a live version of your painting at all times in grayscale on top of the color work you're doing in the active window. It's the one thing I miss from my old Photoshop days, and Clip Studio, I beg you, make this a possibility when opening a file in a second instance. It would help so much. That said, I'm on Clip Studio Paint version 2, so maybe newer versions already have that. I just haven't shelled out money for that yet. I know you can open paintings in a second instance, but everything you do in there, even just changing the color mode, would impact your active window just as well, so that doesn't really help at the moment. When color blocking, I tend to work my way from back to front. In this case, tackle the sky first, usually with a gradient, just to get an initial feeling for a time of day and atmosphere. This may change later on, but we have to start somewhere. Afterwards, I plugged in the clouds. Since I decided to have a storm approaching, I made that part real dark, and I kind of wanted that contrast of dark clouds ahead and sun still illuminating the grass and parts of the beach. I love it when you look at really dark clouds in the sky and have the sun in your back. It looks weirdly wrong, but also fascinating. I also wrapped the clouds around a bit, so they're hugging the coastline, and also contrast with the other diagonal lines that I've got separating the planes in this piece, so the storm also moved back to the left. I wanted some topographical elevation a little away from the surf as well, so I went with some cliffs a bit inland. And the grass is settled on top of that. White sandy beaches are great in real life and I could walk along those for hours, but for paintings at this angle they bring little visual interest. A lower angle might show the reflection of light from the sky in the wet sand. It's really interesting to paint, but at this angle the wet sand just looks a bit darker than usual. I experimented a little with the lighting, having sun rays coming from above, but it didn't really get the effect I wanted. It's probably best to leave that for scenes that are more cloudy or have foliage above where the sun rays are just coming through. But better to try and fail than not giving it a shot at all. At the very least, it solidified where I wanted the light to come from. I still wanted Kyo's back to be in shadow, that way she'd still have value contrast to the lighter parts in the midground. I was having trouble with my usual process of plucking out colors and slapping multiply, overlay and soft light layer modes on top. What works for the greens and the grass did not help me with the ocean at all, which is why it is important to keep referencing the real thing through either photos, video or in-person observation, if you have that possibility. I mean, who would have thought that adding yellowish light to a blue background would result in a green tint? A lot of people actually, but that's the thing. A drawing software, as far as they've come in the past 10 years, it's not a lighting engine and a far cry from reality. You still need to apply your observation properly. The tool can help, but it only works with the input you give it, and if the input isn't quite right, the result won't be either. In the end, I managed to settle on something I thought was somewhat okay. I merged some layers to keep them easier to tell apart. I like to keep my layers as minimal as possible if I don't have a lot of moving pieces in a painting, although my comic pages would decry the fact and would be right. And then I left this piece for the day. As important as it is for me to get this illustration done for this video, there is such a thing as stressing too much. I noticed this impacting my mood, and that's not good. It'll feed back into the piece, and no matter how well it might turn out in the end, I'd always associate it with the stress and dissatisfaction I felt while working on it. Walking away from a piece for the day is also good to reset your view on it in general. It's good to do when you feel like you're forcing something that isn't cooperating. Now, I'm in the position to do that time-wise. I have nobody but myself cracking the whip. If you're on a time limit, plan your breaks accordingly. In the end, I left the piece for a bit longer. I had built up a bit of dread regarding it, because I had to fight it so hard to get anywhere. I decided in order to focus on it better, I'd make it the object of my Friday stream. Which, by the way, I stream art on Fridays, and I talk about my thought process in those streams real time a lot too. Articulating the thing I'm currently doing sometimes helps find the path through those actions, and it helps my viewers to know what is currently stumping me. So if you have any questions left over after this video, you can leave them in the comments, yes, but if you're free while I'm streaming art, I can much easier demonstrate the reply, and chances are Elise is also blessing us with some purrs. Okay, self-promo over. During the stream, I mostly tackled the rendering. Upon reopening the file, I saw that things weren't quite as dire as my brain had made them out to be, which is where gaining some distance from a piece really shines. If you look at something with fresh eyes, often it doesn't compare to the image you build up in your mind, and usually for the better. I rearranged the foreground a bit more to keep it in line with the diagonal I've had going for the horizon, as something that was working against the rim of the storm. That meant some light editing of the ocean further down as well. One more thing I saw a bit more critical as well, which I fixed a little earlier in this footage, is how the light sand color meets Kyo's light colored sleeve. I pulled out another glyph to separate those two a little bit better. Other than those two areas, I could then jump straight into making the color blobs pretty. While I generally recommend working from back to front, in this case I started with the foreground, as that one would be the most detailed and I wanted that focus area to be established. I've got tons of very nice grass brushes, some of which lend themselves very nicely for the scene I'm setting. Most of these are by Devin L. Kurtz, also known as Temperella, and they are free on their Gumroad. The brushes work across Clip Studio, Procreate, and any app or program that accepts .apr brush files, such as Photoshop. I'll leave the link to them in the description. Having these brushes makes the work a lot faster. There's a good mix of crisp and softer brushes in those sets, but especially in terms of color, you have to pay attention to what you're doing. Just damping them in without regards to how they are looking in certain colors doesn't really work, so keep that in mind. Layering them properly is also a must to make sure you've got a believable patch of grass. To see how the brushes behave, I often make strokes off the target area, just to see how they would look standing by themselves, and if that look is something I want in my grass in any given scene. Sometimes the answer is yes, other times the answer is no. Next up are the clouds. For something so variable in shape and form, clouds are really hard to draw well. It's something I've always struggled with, so I default to cloud brushes on the far horizon a lot. I didn't have this luxury this time around, since the storm cloud is rather prominent. I didn't want too much texture around the light edges for this one, I wanted a softer look. The storm is already menacing enough on its own, it doesn't need to threaten anymore on top of that. I chose a brush that has a sharp edge on one side and a softer edge on the other. By spinning the canvas around like a madwoman, I could take advantage of either without editing the brush at all. That is another thing, rotate your canvas. It makes strokes so much easier in certain directions, as you will be using your elbow and shoulder more effectively, especially on a larger screen tablet. But even with smaller tablets, you can use your elbow a bit more and thus relieve your wrist a bit. I don't remember the original keyboard shortcut for rotating canvases in Clip Studio. Since I changed it in my version to be Alt and the spacebar, I've gotten used to that in Paint Tools I and didn't want to adjust my muscle memory. It was hard enough to remember rotating a canvas in Photoshop works by pressing R. I rotate my canvases constantly. It's so ingrained at this point that whenever I think of showing a recording of my screen later on, people must be getting nauseous and dizzy just from watching things spin around all the time. I ended up being very happy with those clouds. I adjusted the colors a little with an overlay layer and a soft brush, just so the gradient from light to dark looks a bit more cohesive. And on we go to the midground. I decided to leave the water for last, so the bit of landmass is my next target. Again, I tend to work my way from back to front and wanted some of the hills to have a sliver of shadow on top, just to show how close the storm already is. Otherwise, for all intents and purposes, it could still be far out, if extremely huge. And then I went about texturing the grass and cliffs and beach a fair bit. I keep it simple and don't go into too much detail, as everything is far away from the viewer, so there is no need to look at every pixel. It would also look very flat if I did that. Detail is a tool to use with intent. Put it where you want the focus of your piece. Everything else will be okay with the illusion of detail through texture. You can see that on paintings throughout history too, so if you're in a gallery next time, try to determine where it is that the creator wants you to look. It's usually the area with the most contrast and the most detail. In a way, it is an expression of how our brains work as well. We are constantly flooded with impressions, and the brain needs to filter out the details that are most important in that moment. Sometimes it's better at it than other times, but it's trying its best. Most days, anyway. On top of helping with focus in the piece, it'll also save you many hours. There is an 80-20 rule in painting. Spend 80% of your time on the 20 most important percent, and vice versa. You can scale that up to 70-30, but I wouldn't recommend going much higher than that. In this piece, I reserved the 20% of importance for Q and the edge of the storm cloud. Even after rendering, the ocean and the surf are still rather rough around the edges, if you zoom in. Same goes for the cliffs and definitely for the grass. And that is on purpose. One thing I personally need to work on is my line dependency. I tend to pull a brush back and forth and then you have a lot of lines next to each other. They might not be as prominent in the finished piece, but when you zoom in you see it a lot with my strokes. And I need to get better about painting an area rather than a line. It is something that I'm working on. Once the rendering is complete, it is time for the finishing touches. As I thought earlier, I had to adjust Q's coattails a little to flow a bit better. And I also adjusted her shading accordingly. I decided against crisp cell shading in this piece and instead blended it out more and made it softer in the process. I tend to have the shadow color, in this case blue, and the light color, yellow, and set that layer to normal so I can keep my focus on the shading and the form of the object or person. I'll add in some bounce light, which depends on the environment. In this case that would be green, as the grass around her is greenish yellowish. Theory behind that is that grass absorbs all but the green wavelength of light. That one bounces off, our eye catches it, and thus we say grass is green. In a nutshell. People who know the physics of light better, don't come for me please. On top of making it more realistic, it also helps to integrate Cleo better into the scenery. Her red coat sticks out like a sore thumb, but in a hopefully believable way now. To integrate her further, I'm putting some grass around her, and do some light magic with overlay layers, and then I finish her off by making her hair glow a bit. And that is the end of the painting process. Never forget to sign your creations and put watermarks on it. Putting them through either glaze or nightshade for some protection, and dataset poisoning is also recommended. Saving the drawing at a lower resolution also helps if you want to post it on the internet, both with the bandwidth and also to prevent thievery of high quality drawings. But yeah, this is the finished piece. I hope I could shed some light on my process and my thoughts while I'm painting something. If you've got any questions about a particular step, feel free to leave them in the comments or bring them to an upcoming livestream. Until then, don't forget to subscribe, watch some more videos of mine, and enjoy the rest of your day. Kapla!